The wind howled across the dry plains like a mournful ghost, carrying with it the scent of dust, pine, and long-forgotten dreams. Late that evening, as twilight deepened over the Montana frontier, a woman in a worn shawl appeared on the narrow road that led to Elijah Grant's lonely ranch. Her figure, bent slightly against the wind, moved slowly as if every step carried the weight of the past. Her name was Martha Hale, a widow who had buried her husband 2 winters ago and lost everything in the month since: her farm, her pride, her sense of home. The trail had left her shoes cracked, her hands rough, and her heart numb. When she saw the faint lantern light glowing from Elijah's cabin, she paused, wondering if she had the strength to beg one last time for shelter. Inside, Elijah, a quiet, broad-shouldered cowboy with years of solitude carved into his face, was mending the reins of his horse when he heard the knock. Few ever came this far west without purpose. He opened the door slowly, his eyes narrowing against the wind, and found a woman standing there, her cheeks wind-burned, her shawl trembling around her shoulders. "Sir," she began, her voice hoarse but steady, "I don't ask for charity, only a roof for the night. I can cook, clean, whatever you need." Her words were humble but not broken. They carried a quiet strength, the kind forged by grief and long miles. Elijah studied her in silence. His cabin had been empty for years, filled only with the sounds of a ticking clock and the creak of the wooden boards under his boots. He wasn't used to company, especially not a woman's voice at his door. "You cook, you say?" he murmured, scratching at his stubble. Martha nodded. "I do. I once kept a kitchen that could feed a crew of farmhands." A faint smile crossed her lips, but it vanished just as quickly. Elijah's gaze softened, but only slightly. "All right then," he said, finally stepping aside. "You can stay, but—" His tone changed, almost teasing, though his eyes were still solemn. "Only if you season the food with laughter. Been a long time since I heard any of that in here." Martha blinked, taken aback. For a moment she didn't know whether to smile or cry. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to her kindly, even in jest. "I can try," she whispered, stepping inside. The warmth of the small fire hit her cheeks, and for the first time in months she felt safe, if only barely. Elijah pointed to a stool near the stove. "There's flour and beans, maybe some salt pork. Ain't much, but you'll make it better than I can, I reckon." She nodded, grateful for the task. As she began to work, her hands moved with a steadiness that surprised even her. The simple rhythm of cooking and stirring, chopping, tasting felt like prayer. Elijah watched her quietly, the smell of sizzling pork filling the air. He realized how much he had forgotten about the comfort of another person's presence, the soft clatter of utensils, the murmured hum of a woman's breath. When she finally turned to serve the food, their eyes met briefly. "Ain't fancy," she said softly, "but it's warm." He took the plate from her, nodded, and after a few bites looked up. "You've got a gift, Mrs. She hesitated. "Hale, Martha Hale." He nodded again. "Elijah Grant," he said. "And for the record, it's more than warm. Reminds me of something I ain't had in years." They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't the heavy kind. Outside, the wind continued to whisper around the cabin, and inside, the fire crackled like old friends rediscovering their voice. After the meal, Elijah poured her a cup of coffee. "Ain't much," he said, "but it'll help you sleep." She cupped the tin mug in her hands, her eyes lowering. "Thank you," she murmured, "for the food and the kindness." He leaned back in his chair. "Ain't kindness. Just decency. You've been walking a long road, I can tell. You don't gotta say where from." "Not tonight." She nodded, tears glinting faintly in her tired eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a stranger to the world. That night, as she lay on a small cot near the fire, she listened to the creak of the old ranch house and thought of her late husband, the way he used to laugh over burnt biscuits and cold stew. But there was something in Elijah's quiet company that stirred something fragile in her. Not love, not yet, but the faint memory of it. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself that she'd only stay a day or two, just long enough to rest her feet and repay her debt. She didn't know that the man snoring softly across the room would soon become the keeper of her last hope, or that laughter, the very thing he asked of her, would be the first and last thing they'd ever share. The next morning broke pale and gold over the ridges, the kind of dawn that promised a hard day's work but whispered peace to those who were willing to earn it. Elijah rose early, as he always did, the creak of his boots waking Martha from a light, dreamless sleep. She sat up slowly, blinking at the dim light, unsure for a moment where she was. Then she smelled coffee, strong, bitter, and freshly brewed, and remembered. She watched him for a moment as he moved about the cabin, his silhouette steady and deliberate, like a man who'd long ago learned the value of silence. "You're up early," she murmured. He looked over his shoulder, a faint grin under his beard. "Out here the sun don't wait for no one." "But I reckon you know that already," she smiled faintly. "I used to." There was a pause, then she rose, wrapped her shawl tight, and stepped to the stove. "Let me fix breakfast. It's the least I can do." Elijah hesitated, then nodded, pouring her a cup of coffee before heading outside to feed the horses. The cabin filled again with the rhythm of life. The scrape of utensils, the low hum of a woman's voice, the quiet sounds that turn an empty house into a home. When Elijah came back inside, the table was set with biscuits and gravy. He blinked. "You made these from scratch?" he asked. Martha shrugged, pretending not to be proud. "Old habit. I had to keep a house full of hungry men fed once upon a time." They ate together in comfortable silence, though it wasn't long before Elijah broke it with a low chuckle. "You ever notice," he said, "how a man can live 10 years alone and forget what laughter sounds like?" Martha looked up, her eyes curious. "And now?" she asked. Elijah's gaze softened, his voice turning quieter. "Now I'm remembering." Over the following days, the widow and the cowboy fell into an unspoken rhythm. She mended curtains that had long since given up, polished the old stove until it shone, and coaxed color back into the cabin with small touches: wildflowers in a tin cup, neatly folded linens, the scent of soap and stew filling the air. Elijah, for his part, found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about the land, the way the storms came rolling down from the mountains, the coyotes that sang at night, the endless silence that both comforted and haunted him. Sometimes she would laugh softly at his stories, her voice carrying across the room like birdsong. It startled him every time, that sound. It was gentle, healing, and yet it stirred something he couldn't quite name. At night they would sit by the fire. Elijah would carve bits of wood into small figures, horses, birds, once even a woman's face, though he didn't tell her who it reminded him of. Martha would sew quietly beside him, sometimes humming old hymns. There was no pretense between them, only a shared understanding that both had lived through sorrow too heavy for words. One evening, after a long day of rain, Elijah returned from the barn soaked to the bone. Martha scolded him softly, insisting he sit near the fire while she fetched a dry blanket. "You'll catch your death out there," she said, her voice sharp with concern. He smiled faintly. "Been flirting with death most my life, ma'am. He ain't much company." She frowned, draping the blanket over his shoulders. "Then maybe it's time you learned better company," she said quietly. Their eyes met then, really met, and something passed between them that neither dared to name. For a heartbeat, the cabin was utterly still, save for the rain tapping gently against the window. Then Martha looked away, her cheeks flushed. "I'll fix you something warm," she murmured, retreating to the stove. Elijah watched her, his heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. From that night on, there was a change. Small, but undeniable. Elijah found himself looking forward to her laughter, the way her presence softened the edges of his solitude. Martha, in turn, began to feel life return to her hands, her voice, even her smile. One evening, as she hung laundry in the fading light, Elijah joined her, taking the wet sheet from her grasp. "You work too hard," he said. "Hard work's all I know," she replied. "It keeps me from remembering too much." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes forgetting's the only way to keep breathing," he said quietly. That night, as the stars spilled across the black sky, Elijah found her sitting on the porch, her hands folded in her lap. "You miss him," he said softly, not as a question but as a truth. Martha didn't deny it. "Every day," she whispered. "He was kind, gentle, but sickness took him slow, and there's no fighting what's already gone." Her voice trembled, but she did not cry. Elijah stared out at the dark horizon. "I buried someone once too," he said. "Not a wife, but my brother. Died young, senselessly. After that, I stopped talking much to God." They sat in silence for a long while. The night was cool, and the wind carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. Finally, Elijah turned to her, his voice soft as a confession. "You bring light back into this place, Martha Hale. I didn't think that was possible anymore." She smiled sadly, her eyes glistening. You said I had to season with laughter, remember? Maybe laughter's the only thing that keeps the dark from winning. He reached for her hand, rough meeting rough, and she didn't pull away. There was no promise in that touch, only understanding. Two hearts bruised by loss finding a fragile peace in one another's quiet. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods, and somewhere far off a coyote called to the moon. In that sound, in that lonely harmony, both of them found something they hadn't felt in years. Not joy exactly, but the tender ache of living again. Summer came early that year, soft and golden, painting the wide plains in hues of honey and wheat. The days stretched long and slow across the Montana frontier, the air humming with cicadas and the scent of wild sage. Elijah's ranch, once a place of silence and neglect, now breathed again. The porch was swept clean, the barn repaired, the fences mended. And in the evenings when the work was done, the cabin windows glowed like a beacon across the empty land. Inside, laughter sometimes echoed, quiet, careful, like something still learning its strength. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was alive again. Martha had been there for nearly 2 months now. What began as a single night's refuge had become something unspoken, a home neither of them wanted to name. She rose early, as she always had on the farm she'd lost, and cooked while the morning mist still clung to the hills. Elijah would come in from the barn, boots dusty, hat low, and they'd share breakfast before the day began. Sometimes she'd hum while she worked, old songs from her childhood, and he'd listen quietly, never interrupting. Other times he'd tell her stories about his years on the cattle trail, his voice low and steady like the rhythm of hooves on earth. It was a strange kind of comfort, the kind that made the hours pass unnoticed. The pain they both carried didn't vanish, but it softened like a scar fading in sunlight. One morning, as Martha hung laundry near the creek, Elijah rode up from the southern pasture. "Fence is holding strong," he said, dismounting. "You've got a good hand with that line." She laughed. "I grew up mending fences, Elijah Grant. You don't forget those things." Her laughter startled a flock of birds from the grass, and for a moment Elijah just stood there, hat in hand, watching her with quiet wonder. Later, when the heat drove them inside, he found her at the table sewing a torn sleeve from his shirt. "You're spoiling me," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Next thing I know, you'll have me believing I'm worth all this care." She didn't look up, just smiled faintly. "You are," she said softly. "You just forgot it for a while." The word struck him deeper than she knew. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the faint sound of her breathing from across the room. Slow, steady, peaceful. He hadn't realized until now how much he had grown used to it, how it filled the silence that used to echo like an empty church. He turned his gaze to the ceiling and thought of all the years he'd spent talking only to ghosts and memories. Martha had brought something back he didn't even know he'd lost, the desire to live again. The next morning, he saddled his horse early and told her he was riding into town. "Need supplies," he said. "You want anything?" She shook her head, smiling. "Just bring yourself back safe." It was a simple exchange, but something in the way she said it lingered with him all the way to town. In town, he stopped by the general store and found himself staring at something he hadn't meant to buy, a blue ribbon. Simple, satin soft as morning light. It reminded him of the color Martha's eyes took on when she smiled near the fire. He hesitated only a moment before purchasing it. When he got home that evening, Martha was on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the breeze. "You were gone long," she said. "Thought maybe you'd forgotten the way back." He dismounted, grinning. "Couldn't if I tried." He handed her the small parcel. "Ain't much," he said, almost awkward. "Just thought you might like it." She unwrapped it slowly, her breath catching when she saw the ribbon. For a long moment she said nothing. Then her lips trembled into a smile, soft, shy, the kind of smile that could undo a man's years of loneliness. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "But why?" He shrugged, looking away. "Because the days are brighter with color. Thought maybe you'd wear it. For luck." She tied the ribbon in her hair the next morning. Elijah didn't comment, but his eyes followed her every time she passed by. There was no need for words. The silence between them was filled with a tenderness neither dared speak aloud. They worked side by side, shared meals, shared stories, and when dusk fell, they sat together on the porch watching the sun bleed gold over the horizon. One night, after a long week of rain, Elijah brought out his old fiddle. "Used to play for barn dances," he said quietly. Before life got quiet." Martha smiled, her hands folded in her lap. Then play now. Let's wake up those ghosts. He hesitated, then began to play. Slow, hesitant at first, then smoother, the melody filling the small cabin with warmth. Martha listened, eyes closed, and when the tune softened, she began to hum along. Her voice blended with the fiddle in a harmony that felt like forgiveness. When he finished, she opened her eyes, tears glistening. "That was lovely," she whispered. "My husband used to play too. I thought I'd never hear something that gentle again." Elijah set the fiddle down and looked at her. "You ain't the only one who thought something was gone for good," he said softly. The fire burned low between them. He reached for her hand again, slower this time, less uncertain. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in just enough for her shoulder to rest against his. They stayed that way until the fire died, and when they finally stood, it was as if something sacred had passed between them. Quiet, sure and irrevocable. For a few precious weeks, the world outside didn't exist. There was only the ranch, the land, and two souls learning to love again. Martha found herself laughing without forcing it, singing as she cooked, smiling at his teasing. Elijah began to speak of the future, small things, simple dreams. Could fix the east barn, he'd say. Maybe keep a few more horses. Or once when he was half asleep, he murmured, "Could use a woman's touch round here, if she'd have me." Martha heard him, though he thought she didn't. That night she lay awake long after he slept, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Because deep in her heart, as much as she wanted to believe in new beginnings, she knew the past wasn't done with her yet. Her body had grown weaker these last weeks, a quiet fever returning in the night, the same illness that had taken her husband. She hadn't told Elijah. She couldn't bear to steal his newfound light, so instead she smiled through the pain, seasoned every day with laughter, and prayed that when the end came he'd remember her not for her sorrow, but for the warmth she brought back into his lonely world. The days grew shorter as summer began to wane, the fields ripening under a softer sun. The wind that once smelled of sage now carried the crisp bite of autumn. Around the ranch the colors deepened, amber grass, golden leaves, a sky so blue it seemed too wide for the world. But within the cabin something quieter was changing too. Martha still moved about the kitchen, still hummed as she cooked, still smiled when Elijah teased her about her biscuits being better than any man deserved. Yet there was a slowness in her hands now, a weariness that sleep no longer mended. Elijah noticed before she ever said a word. He'd watch her pause in the middle of stirring a pot, pressing a hand to her side as though catching her breath. Or how she sometimes sat down halfway through hanging laundry, pretending to admire the horizon when really she just needed to rest. He didn't ask, not at first. He'd learned long ago that some truths come only when the heart is ready. But each night when she thought he'd gone to bed, he'd stay awake, listening to her quiet cough, the small, fragile sound that broke the stillness worse than thunder. One morning, when the frost lay heavy on the ground, Elijah saddled his horse before dawn. "I'm riding to town," he told her. "Need supplies before the snows come." She tried to hide her concern. "You went just last week," he smiled faintly. "Then I'll go again. You rest." What he didn't tell her was that he planned to visit Doc Randall. He'd seen that look before, and the pallor, the breath that came too shallow, the faint tremor in her hands. When he returned, his face was darker than the storm clouds building to the west. Doc had said what Elijah already feared: consumption, slow and cruel. There were medicines to ease the pain, but no cure. Elijah stood by his horse for a long time after hearing the words, the wind cutting through his coat. He wasn't sure how to face her, how to speak when all he wanted to do was rage at the heavens for their cruelty. That night, Martha waited for him on the porch. "You've been gone long," she said softly. He forced a smile. "Had a few stops." She patted the chair beside her. "Sit, Elijah. Tell me what you're not saying." Her voice was gentle but sure. She'd always been that way. Quiet strength wrapped in kindness. He sank into the chair, elbows on his knees, staring at the dying light over the hills. "Doc says you need rest," he said finally. "He says it's your lungs." There was no surprise in her eyes, only a sadness that was almost peace. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while now." Elijah turned to her, his voice rough. "Why didn't you tell me?" She smiled faintly, that same soft smile that broke his heart every time. "Because I wanted to remember what it felt like to live." not to be dying in someone's eyes. He looked away, his hands curling into fists. "Martha!" His voice broke, and he had to pause. "You gave me back something I thought was gone. You can't just—" But she reached over, laying her hand over his. "I can't change what's coming, Elijah, but I can choose how I spend what's left." After that night, every moment became precious, the kind that lodges deep in memory, never fading. Elijah built her a chair by the window where the light poured in each morning. She'd sit there wrapped in a quilt, watching the world outside, the horses grazing, the sky changing colors, the man she'd come to love moving through his day. Sometimes he'd come in from the barn and find her humming, her eyes closed, and he'd stand silently just to listen. When she had the strength, she still cooked, though he'd taken to helping more, pretending he didn't know how, just to make her laugh. "You cut that onion like you're fighting it," she'd tease, and he'd grin. "Maybe I am. It's the only thing in this room tougher than me." Their laughter filled the cabin, real, bright, defiant against the ticking clock of her illness. But there were days when she couldn't rise from bed. Elijah would sit beside her, reading softly from an old book of poems or just holding her hand as the fire burned low. Sometimes, when the fever passed, she'd whisper, "You kept your promise, Elijah." He'd tilt his head, puzzled. "What promise?" "You said I could stay if I seasoned the food with laughter," she said, smiling weakly. "I did my best." He would smile back, though tears burned behind his eyes. "You did more than that, Martha Hale. You seasoned this whole damn place with light." The first snow came early. Elijah woke one morning to find the world wrapped in white, the air crisp and silent. Inside, Martha slept fitfully, her breath shallow, her skin pale as the frost on the window. He built the fire higher, made her tea, but she barely sipped it. When she opened her eyes, she whispered, "It's beautiful out there." He nodded, his throat tight. "You'll see it better come spring." She smiled, the faintest curve of her lips. "Maybe, but if not, promise me something." He leaned close, his heart pounding. "Anything. Keep laughing," she whispered. "Even when it hurts. Don't let the silence take this place again." Elijah couldn't answer. He just held her hand, feeling the faint pulse beneath her skin, fragile and fading. Outside, snow fell steadily, blanketing the earth in quiet. Inside, time seemed to stop. When she finally drifted into sleep, her face peaceful, Elijah stayed beside her until dawn broke pale over the hills. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched as the light touched her hair, and knew, before she even stirred, that she'd gone where no pain could follow. For a long time after, Elijah sat alone in that small cabin, the silence pressing close. The ribbon she once wore still hung by the window, blue against the white of winter. He reached for it sometimes, letting it slide between his fingers like a memory. She had kept her promise. She'd filled his life with laughter again. Now it was his turn to keep hers. Winter held on longer that year than anyone could remember. The snow piled high around Elijah Grant's cabin, drifts nearly reaching the porch railings. Days blurred into weeks, the world hushed under white silence. Inside, Elijah moved through, the rooms like a ghost of himself, tending the fire, feeding the horses, mending fences when weather allowed. Not because he cared for any of it, but because the doing was all that kept him from breaking completely. Martha's chair still sat by the window, her quilt folded neatly over the backrest, her blue ribbon tied to one of the wooden posts. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, the ribbon would flutter gently, and he'd imagine she was still there, turning her head to smile at him. He buried her beneath the cottonwoods near the creek, where she used to gather wildflowers in the spring. It was a quiet day, only the whisper of snowflakes and the soft murmur of his voice as he said her name one last time. He marked her, grave with a simple cross carved from oak, her ribbon tied around it. He'd thought about words, something fitting or fine, but in the end he chose none. She'd never needed fancy things. Only truth. And the truth was this. She had come into his life like dawn, breaking over endless night. And now that she was gone, the world was dim again, but somehow gentler for having known her. For weeks, Elijah didn't speak to anyone. The townsfolk saw him sometimes, quiet, distant, bringing supplies or posting letters. No one ever saw him write. They whispered about the widow who'd lived with him that summer, how she'd softened him, how laughter had been heard at the Grant place again. When they asked where she'd gone, he only said, "She went home." But even grief changes shape if you let it. Come early spring, when the snows began to melt, Elijah found himself drawn back to the small patch by the creek where she rested. He built a bench there from old timber and sat each evening as the sun went down. Some nights he spoke aloud, telling her about the horses, about the coming planting, about nothing at all. Other times, he simply sat in silence, listening to the wind moving through the trees. And then, one afternoon, something happened that made him believe her promise had kept its truth. It was early May. The air smelled of rain and thawed earth, and the creek was running high with meltwater. Elijah had been mending a broken rail when he heard it, faint at first, then clear, laughter. A woman's laughter, light and fleeting, carried on the wind. He froze, heart hammering, his eyes scanning the open land. But there was no one there, only the breeze and the sound of leaves trembling. He bowed his head, a sad smile tugging at his mouth. "You keep your word, Martha Hale," he whispered, "even from heaven." From that day on, he kept her alive in small ways. Every morning he brewed 2 cups of coffee, setting one by the window before taking his own outside. Every evening, he played the fiddle, clumsy at first, then softer, truer, until the notes sounded like the laughter she'd once brought into the cabin. The sound carried across the plains, and travelers passing by would slow their horses, hearing that music drifting from a lonely ranch house glowing with lamplight. Some said the man inside was mad from grief. Others said he was blessed, still keeping company with a love too strong to die. Years passed and the world moved on. The railroad stretched farther west, new settlers came, and Elijah grew older, slower. His beard turned silver, his back bent a little more each year, but the light in his eyes, the one Martha had rekindled, never fully went out. Every spring, wildflowers bloomed thicker around her grave, spreading like laughter taking root in the soil. And sometimes on the warmest nights, he swore he could hear her humming from the porch, the melody mingling with the wind through the cottonwoods. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the land in gold and crimson, Elijah sat by her grave with his fiddle. His hands trembled as he played the tune she'd loved, slow and tender, full of the ache of memory. When he finished, he set the bow down, leaning back against the bench, his eyes on the sky. "You seasoned this place right, Martha," he murmured. "Laughter still lives here, you'd be proud." His voice cracked a little, but he smiled anyway. "Guess I'll be seeing you soon." The next morning, a ranch hand from town rode out to check on him. He found Elijah sitting on that same bench, the fiddle resting across his knees, his hat tilted forward, eyes closed as if in sleep. The air was still, the creek running quiet beside him. The hand called his name once, then again, softer. There was no answer. The man rode back to town with tears in his eyes, for even in death Elijah looked peaceful, a man finally at rest beside the one who had given him back his heart. They buried him beside her under the cottonwoods, where the wildflowers had already begun to bloom. The town preacher said a few words, but it was the wind that carried the truest prayer, a low, steady whisper through the leaves that sounded, to those who listened closely, like laughter. Years later, travelers would still pass the old Grant place, long abandoned but standing firm against time. Some swore that when the evening light hit the windows just right, you could see a woman in a blue ribbon sitting by the fire, and a man beside her, laughing softly at something she said. And if the wind was kind, it would carry the faint scent of stew and coffee, and the sound of a fiddle playing a melody that never quite ended. Because love like theirs doesn't vanish. It lingers, in the land, in the air, in every moment where kindness still finds its way into lonely hearts. And somewhere beyond that horizon where the plains meet the stars, Martha Hale and Elijah Grant walked together again, her hand in his, their laughter echoing forever across the wild, endless west.